Hi, welcome to DIY Homebrew. My name is Jay, and I'm going to talk to you today about when is your beer done? Everyone wants to know how long it's going to take for their beer to ferment. As a general rule, it's 2 weeks. Do you have a 2-gallon fermenter? 2 weeks. Do you have a 5-gallon bucket? 2 weeks. Do you have one yeast packet? 2 weeks. Now, some people will tell you that you need to ferment in your beer for 3 weeks, and you can, but there's a diminishing return at a certain point. So day 1 to day 3 chemically are vastly different. You're going from a water, your wort, and it's being converted into alcohol. Day 1 to 14 is also a huge difference, but day 14 to 17 or to 20, it's not as much of a difference. There will be some clarification in your product, but it's not going to be necessarily worth it. Bigger and longer and is not always better. Now, when it comes to figuring out how to store your beer, the 65 to 75 range for most beginners and most beginner kits and yeast is fine. If you store your beer on the hot side, you're going to come out with some off flavors. It's probably going to still be drinkable, but it's also going to brew faster, yes, but it's still going to have possibly some citrusy flavors, some different esters to it, depending on the yeast. And if your temperature is too low, 60 degrees, it's going to slow the yeast, and that is going to take longer to ferment. However, under ideal circumstances, about 2 weeks. And conventional wisdom is if you go longer than 2 weeks, really you're more risking an infection in your beer. That's something dust, or somebody forgets their fermenter is even there, and bugs I've heard of before. But please, leave your fermenter in a semi-clean environment. Like I do with my 2-gallon, I'll put it inside of my cooler, and that will, with the lid open, my camping cooler, with the lid open, that will let the yeast produce carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide leaves the fermenter like it's supposed to, and then doesn't get stuck inside the cooler, which actually could hurt the yeast with too much CO2 buildup. And it protects my floor from spills. It protects my 2-gallon fermenter from just general particulate stuff if there's anything dusty flying around. Keep it in a dark place. In the given temperature range, depending on the yeast, you'll see 65 to 75 for most of your beginner kits, and it should take about 2 weeks. If you want to do a secondary ferment, now this is a little bit more advanced, and some people say you need a secondary. Secondary fermentation is where you're storing your wort in one fermenter and then moving it into another for another week or two, and that's totally fine. Some of the more delicate beers, the things you want to get the flavor profile just so, it's really more for that. It's a very common practice for wine to be secondary fermented and then bottled or kegged. In a beginner's area, like where you're going to be at, primary fermentation is fine. I don't even secondary ferment. So basically, I make my wort, I put my yeast in, I keep it within the temperature range, 65 to 75, and look at the yeast packet. Keep in mind that, again, a little bit higher, not a big deal, a little lower, not a huge deal, but it's going to affect your time. Then, when the beer tastes, and you do take a sample, when the beer tastes like flat beer, bitter, no longer sweet, it's done. There are more mathematical ways to tell. It doesn't hurt to go a couple of days beyond 14 anyway, just to be on the safe side. In fact, when you're new and you're bottling, you want to make sure that fermentation process is completely finished, at least down as far as it possibly can be. Because if you bottle your beer after a week, under normal circumstances, fermentation continuing inside the bottles can actually create a mess, and with glass bottles could create bottle bombs. Now, I haven't had one, but I keep my beer fermented for 14 to 17 days, maybe 19 if I added a lot of extra extract to it. But basically, you can start sampling it every other day, as early as 11 days, but you're probably not going to see the end result you need there. You're going to want to wait until about 14 days to take your first sample, and it might be the one you need. At which point, when you bottle and you do the sugar thing, you're actually putting sugar in the bottles. The yeast that are still in the beer, once it's been poured into the bottles, will eat that sugar and convert it into CO2, a little more alcohol, and that is what carbonates your beer. So without kegging, without loading it full of CO2 and any of that other stuff through that process, you can just do it right in the bottle. And then letting it sit in the bottle for about 3 weeks is best. At which point, take it out, put it in the fridge, put a couple in the fridge, and let them sit for 24 hours, and keep at least a couple in the fridge. And basically every dinner, if you're like me and you like beer with dinner, I've had basically my 2 or 3 bottles, the oldest one sitting in there for 48 hours or so. I'm drinking it. So basically the full run time is about 5 weeks to get your beer done. At which case, it wouldn't hurt for you to buy a lot of bottles, because you may not want to be into kegging. I'm not. I like to age my beer this way. And you want to build up a stockpile, and every time you have enough bottles to warrant brewing a batch, that's what I do, and I fill those bottles up after the 14-day primary fermentation, and away you go. And I just keep my stock going that way. Wouldn't hurt to have 2 2-gallon fermenters if you're doing it that way. 3-gallon fermenters are also popular, and of course the 5-gallon bucket that you usually get from your northern brewer or something like that is also a great choice. No problem with any of those. So, what have we learned? 2 weeks. If you're brewing a beer that has, like I said, a lot of extra fermentables, longer than 2 weeks. But don't do that right away. Let's stick with the normal kits. Let's keep it within the recipe spec, and try to learn the best we can from sanitation, and enjoy our first beers. Alright, so as always, like, share, subscribe, DIY Homebrew. My name is Jay. Have a good one.